Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we have some very big news, expected news, but still big news nonetheless, out of the 2026 Maine Senate race where Democratic candidate Graham Platner has officially suspended all campaign operations. He's essentially dropping out of this race. So first things first, I'm going to break down all the latest news that we have for you as of the time I'm recording this video on what this means, on who the next candidates could be to replace Graham Platner, and where things start out for this 2026 Maine Senate race. So first things first, I first saw it from X, from the Politics and Poll Tracker account. They said that Graham Platner is officially suspending campaign operations. In a quote from Platner, he said, "For the moment to continue, it can't be me. For that reason, we are suspending campaign operations. We're not doing it because of the allegations. We're doing it because of the structures that are being taken away from us by those in power," is what Platner said. Platner also said, "My name may be on the ballot right now, but that ballot line belongs to the people of Maine." And in a call to his supporters, Platner also says whatever happens next is up to the Maine Democratic Party. Let's see. There also was a poll as well. Politics Poll Tracker talked about the PPP poll, which I'll be talking about a little bit as well, but I can honestly do it here. They said, "I wouldn't put a lot of stock into the results of the Senate poll because I'm skeptical Bellows and Shah would be tied with Collins and a Platner internal. The only plausible results from this poll seem to be for Platner and Jackson, likely a sign that Platner is tipping his hat for Democrats to nominate him." And I'll be getting more into that as well. We do know within like half an hour of the Platner news coming out, the former Democratic Maine Senate, I believe Maine Senate president and candidate for governor Troy Jackson officially has launched his U.S. Senate campaign in Maine to replace Graham Platner. So that Platner ally, Troy Jackson's officially launched a campaign in this race. Just a quick little update as well from Politico that said that Platner has not yet officially submitted the paperwork to withdraw from the Senate race, according to a spokesperson for Maine Secretary of State Shenna Bellows' office, who Bellows herself could be a potential candidate as well. A spokesperson said a public declaration is not an official election withdrawal, and a candidate must formally withdraw to the elections office in writing, including the signature. And I do believe, I think that's all the latest information that we have on the Maine Senate race. And then we have the PPP poll, which just came out. We'll be talking about that on Wikipedia in just one moment as well here. So in this poll, some potential matchups they showed were Susan Collins versus Graham Platner. In this poll, which again, PPP poll is like the Democratic campaign poll, showed Collins at 47, Platner at 42. Now, Troy Jackson at 49%, Collins at 44. So that's a 5-point lead. Obviously a very different matchup than the Platner one. For Collins versus Mills, though, Collins is leading 48-37. That's a massive, massive lead for Susan Collins in that race. And Susan Collins versus Jordan Wood is very similar. So now we got to talk about the general election polls as well, where we have two polls now for Troy Jackson versus Susan Collins, and they show pretty similar results. The Wedgwood polls from July 4th through 6th shows it at 48-43 for Jackson over Susan Collins. So both polls here show Troy Jackson's in a very strong place. We do know Troy Jackson, if Graham Platner got to pick a single candidate, he'd probably be pretty high on that list. So Jackson, the early polls, is starting out strong for him. Another Democrat in the race, Dan Kleben, as well in the public policy poll from September of 2025, was leading over Collins by roughly about 9 points. So now let's take a look at the Democratic nominating convention. We know the scandals of Graham Platner. I don't want to go too much detail into those because I'm not sure what I'm allowed to say on YouTube in terms of this stuff, because I know some of this stuff is sensitive topic. So I'll leave it on the screen. If you want to read it and pause it, you can. But obviously the information's online if you want to look for that. In terms of what happens now, because I know this is going to be a very big question, what happens next? Well, according to the Maine statute, Platner has until 5 p.m. on July 13th to withdraw in order to be replaced by as the nominee, which he obviously just did. If he does so, the Maine Democratic Party may select a new nominee before July 27th. No political party in Maine has replaced their nominee in an election before. While the exact process to be used was not immediately certain, Maine Democratic Party officials and others, like Maine Senate President Matty Doherty, called for an open and inclusive process. On July 8th, which is obviously yesterday, the Maine Democratic Party voted to hold a state party convention to nominate a candidate to replace Platner as the Democratic nominee. So we do know two candidates are officially in this race, the most notable being Troy Jackson, the former president of the Maine Senate, candidate for Maine's 2nd District in 2014, and obviously we know him from the governor's race in 2026, where I think he came in, I want to say 3rd in that governor primary behind Hannah Pingree and Nirav Shah. And then Dan Kleben, a brewery owner and primary candidate for the seat as well, is declared for this race once again. Paige Loud, a social worker who was a candidate for Maine's 2nd Congressional District in 2026, has filed paperwork to run, with a handful of other Democrats who have expressed interest. It's almost just like the Democratic governor primary part 2. Shenna Bellows, the Secretary of State, has expressed interest in running. David Costello, the former Deputy Secretary of Maryland Department of Environment and nominee for U.S. Senate in 2024, is running for the seat. Valley Geiger, a state representative, I saw a report that said she claimed that Platner would support her in a Democratic primary. I'm not totally sure if that's true or not, if that's just her saying that, but she is running. Nirav Shah, who finished in 2nd in the governor's race, the former principal deputy director of Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the candidate for governor in Maine 2026, has expressed interest. And then Jordan Wood, the former chief of staff to Representative Katie Porter, and candidate for the Maine 2nd Congressional District in 2026, they have all publicly expressed interest in running. Now, other Democratic names who are potential candidates still include Janet Mills, the current governor of Maine, Sarah Gideon, the Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, and Aaron Frey, the Maine Attorney General. We do know a handful of Democrats have ruled out running for this race, including Joe Baldacci, the state senator and candidate for the 2nd District in 2026. Patrick Dempsey, the actor, who I did not know people were asking him to run, so that was very interesting to see that headline. U.S. Representative of the 2nd District, Jared Golden, who would probably be like the Democrat version of Susan Collins, announced he's not interested in running for the race. And Heather Cox Richardson, a historian, has also declined a run as well. So where do things currently stand in terms of who's going to be the Democratic candidate? Because I know that's going to be the big question. Some may even say the main question of this race. Well, first we can look, because there's obviously no polling yet for a Democratic primary, we can look to Polymarket to see what people are thinking so far. Troy Jackson currently has 44%, Shenna Bellows has 23%, Nirav Shah 16%, Dan Kleben 4%, and Janet Mills has 4%. That is on Polymarket. And my own personal thoughts on this race are, obviously it's still very early, and the Democratic Party having a convention is certainly going to really complicate things. But I think the Democrats in Maine saw Graham Platner, and I'll pull up the election results here from Maine from 2026 as well, because the Democratic primary voters in Maine made a very definitive statement that they didn't just want any Democrat, they wanted Graham Platner to be their nominee. He got 72.32% of the vote and got 153,000, nearly 154,000 votes against the current governor in Janet Mills. So clearly there are a lot of Democrats in Maine that came out to vote for Graham Platner that wanted him to be the nominee. And that could be an argument for the Democrats to nominate someone that's more of a progressive, socialist type, farther left Democrat, similar to Platner, that nominating an establishment Democrat maybe would anger a lot of Maine voters. So I think that's a conversation that's probably factored into this decision here. Now, of all the candidates that are running or potentially running, the obvious one that fits that bill would be Troy Jackson, the former president of the Maine Senate. If you're unfamiliar, in the governor's race, he had the endorsement of Bernie Sanders. Obviously, he's one of the biggest faces in the Democratic Party of that socialist, progressive type of Democratic candidate, sort of in the similar mold of like Zohran Mamdani and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Troy Jackson, so far in that governor's race, fits the bill of the candidate most closely aligned to Graham Platner in terms of policy and such on that. So I think Troy Jackson would fit the most similar mold to Graham Platner. It's going to be interesting, though, because if they do a party convention there, then obviously the Secretary of State in Shenna Bellows is going to have a lot of political connections with several Democratic figures across the state. Nirav Shah will likely have less than Shenna Bellows, but he did just run for governor, so obviously a lot of people in the state of Maine got to know him as well. But I would think in order of likelihood for me in my rankings, I would have it Troy Jackson as the most likely Democratic candidate to replace Platner. Shenna Bellows would be 2, and Nirav Shah would be 3 for me. I don't think Jordan Wood or Valley Geiger or David Costello at this current point in time, I don't think I'd put them in my top 3 most likely. I think Troy Jackson for me is clearly number 1. Bellows is clearly number 2. Nirav Shah is clearly number 3. And then I think we go from there in terms of what's most likely after that. Troy Jackson, I think, is someone that sort of fits that bill, though, of that Platner type candidate, someone that can carry the momentum that Platner had in the primary, and I think someone that may arguably just beat Graham Platner without as many scandals from a policy and getting people out to vote standpoint. So as of where I think it goes next, I think the Democratic candidate, we're going to have to wait and see for the process to play out, but I think Troy Jackson is the most likely Democratic candidate to replace Platner right now. And then we saw in those early polls where things stand. A lot of the rankings on this race probably won't change too much. They'll probably still remain a toss-up. But we saw in the early polling, only 2 polls, so grain of salt. But public policy polling shows Jackson at 49, Collins at 44. That's about a 5-point Democratic lead. Now, if you see my prior videos, you'll know this. When I see an internal poll that has a D or an R next to their name, those are biased internal polls. So usually I count about 4 to 5% in the opposite direction of the pollster to account for the bias of the partisanship of the poll. So if a Democrat's up by 5, usually that means the Democrat's probably either up by 1 point or they're tied with the Republican. In the Wedgwood polls, though, who I don't know if it's a Democratic pollster or not, doesn't have an R or D next to it, Jackson's leading here by 5 points. But even still, if you did say, well, both of those are Democratic bias polls, well, that would still mean the race at best for Susan Collins is tied in a matchup versus Troy Jackson. It is significant as well that Jackson's already nearing 50% of the vote against the Republican incumbent in Susan Collins. We know that Maine polling is very tricky. We saw that Sarah Gideon was leaning against Susan Collins in the 2020 Senate race in Maine, and Susan Collins ended up pulling out the win. So we obviously know until Election Day happens and all the results are in, Susan Collins will always have a very strong chance of winning because that's just seems to be how she operated in 2020. But the election environment does suggest this would be a very strong year for the Democrats to potentially win this state. And we can look where things currently stand, where this is going to be a big issue for a lot of Republicans, including Susan Collins in Maine, who even though she frequently breaks with President Trump and the Republicans, Trump's current approval rating is down roughly about 13.4% across the United States. For the generic ballot of the Democrats versus the Republicans for Congress, Democrats are at 45.2, Republicans are at 40.4, which even though the Republicans have gone up about 0.6% in the past week here, you're still looking at around a 5-point lead for the Democrats on the generic ballot. That's for the House, and I guess you could throw in the Senate as well. It spells that the Democrats are in for more of a better night than the Republicans are for 2026. Now, how far will that go is going to be TBD, but it spells that the Democrats are more likely to have a better night than the Republicans in 2026. And that is where things ultimately get interesting here. We can look on electionenjoyer.com and see they did a simulation of the race where it was Susan Collins versus Graham Platner before. Obviously, he dropped out and all the scandals and such. And they, in their prediction, had Platner beating Collins by about 1.2%, needing ranked choice voting to do so, but Platner pulling out a victory there. On the PollsMax website, this is on the House app, we can look for the 2026 Senate race in Maine here, and we can see for Platner versus Collins, they had it a 65.2% chance to win, but that was for Susan Collins. They had Collins favored to win in this one by 2.3%, with the margin of victory being 51.2 for Collins, 48.9 for Platner, likely also needing to go to ranked choice voting. And you see here in the odds of winning right around like June 5th, Platner was at 58%, Collins at 42%. The scandal started to break after Platner was accused. Now going through really to today, Collins at 65, Platner's at 34.8. Now that he's dropped out, we know Platner won't be the next Democratic Senate candidate. But I really think for the Democrats, Troy Jackson kind of fits that mold of being a progressive Democrat that could capture a lot of the Platner energy of the voters, but obviously won't have the same, I would say, scandals most likely. Again, I won't lie, I'm not an expert on Troy Jackson, so I don't know his background or his life story, so I don't know if there's any scandals out there I don't know about, but odds are it's pretty tough to have the same level of scandals that Graham Platner's had so far. So it'll be interesting to see here how things go in this race, because this race is very much not a slam dunk. And to be honest, even with Platner versus Collins, it was never really a slam dunk either. The polling average in this race showed it a very close race, that Susan Collins is leading by 0.5% on the PollsMax average, but Collins is at 47.3, Platner's at 46.8. On Wikipedia, you'd see even more of a lopsided margin here. For Collins versus Platner, they took away the average feature, but the average feature was showing Collins leading Platner, or Platner leading Collins, I think by like 2 points, even like a few weeks ago. Now, they did also show, while we're talking about this, Shenna Bellows versus Susan Collins from that same public policy poll, and they show Collins and Bellows tied at 47-47. So that's a significant part of the poll as well. For Collins versus Shaw, they're tied at 45% apiece. Collins versus Wood, 47-38. For Susan Collins versus Janet Mills, obviously showed in that poll 48-37. And that one, Wedgwood poll showed 47-47 and that. I don't think it's going to be Janet Mills for the Democrats after she dropped out of the race because Platner was doing so strong in the primary. Even though it's going to go to a state convention, that would really anger, I think, a lot of more progressive Democrats. And I don't think the Democrats in Maine are going to do that. I think they're going to go with someone that, like, I don't think it would go more establishment than Shenna Bellows. And Janet Mills would certainly be more establishment than her. So I think we're going to see a race of either Susan Collins versus Nirav Shah, Shenna Bellows, or Troy Jackson. And I think Troy Jackson's where things currently start right now. In Maine, just to wrap up the video, we know how important Maine is on the 2026 Senate map, as the Democrats currently have 44 Senate seats, Republicans have 46, and 10 seats I currently have as toss-up. And Maine is the only Senate seat with a Republican senator in a state that Kamala Harris did win in the 2024 presidential election. The state of Maine voted for Kamala Harris by 6.9%. In 2020, it voted for Joe Biden by 9.1%. So it's not like a California or a New York type state where it's like 15-point margin of victory pretty much every single time, but it's a likely Democratic state. In between 5 and 15%, it's going to vote reliably Democrat at the top of the ticket. Now, Susan Collins has able to defy these odds before. She won in 2020 despite trailing in the polls with 8.6% margin of victory, 50.98 to 42.39 for Sarah Gideon. Back in 2014, she defeated then candidate Shenna Bellows by 37 points. So by some Democrats, the best candidate to go up against her, Collins beat her in 2014 by 37 points. Now, obviously, if Collins and Bellows were the matchup again, even if Collins won, it would certainly not be by 37 points, as the United States arguably is a lot more polarized now than it was in 2014. And Republican midterm year versus Democratic midterm year, it just wouldn't line up the exact same at all. So it's going to be a lot more of a close race. I mean, in the final few days of this race, I had it going for Platner over Collins for a while because I just believe the partisanship of 2026 was going to ultimately break more in the Democrats' direction than Platner's scandals prior to the scandal breaking. After the scandal broke, Collins would have gone into lean Republican for me, probably like a 4.5 to 5 point win, if not even more than that, into likely Republican. But now if it's Troy Jackson versus Susan Collins, I think we're still in that toss-up category of under 5 points. But I'm not going to lie. I think Troy Jackson would do a good enough job of getting a lot of those Platner voters, but still maybe not getting all of them, but getting a pretty good chunk of them. I still think that when ranked choice voting is used, Jackson would defeat Susan Collins in this race because I think that partisanship would just be a little bit too much for Collins in this time around to overcome. Would it be by a large amount? No. I'm thinking like 2.5 to 3% probably when everything is said and done after ranked choice voting. But whether this news is good or bad for the Democrats that Platner's dropping out, we're going to have to wait and see. My initial honestly reaction to this is I think this gives the Democrats probably a stronger chance to win. If Jackson has the same policies as Platner but a lot less baggage, that probably would give the Democrats a better chance at winning. Democrats are going to have to do very well, as they usually do in the urban areas. They have to do well in Portland. They have to do well in Bangor. They have to do well in Kennebunk. But they also have to do well in the rural areas as well. Platner was someone the Democrats would hope would be able to do that. Troy Jackson may be able to do that as well, having the support of Bernie Sanders. So it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. But I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are. Leave your thoughts in the comment section down below. Which Democrat do you think will replace Graham Platner for the 2026 Maine Senate race? For now, though, that is it. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to hit like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in a future video.